Hi, my name is Livi McElrea. I'm going to be doing a seminar today on prep time. So I know that's a pretty basic concept, but this is a seminar that I've given a few times. One of the times was at my old debate club. It's a really good seminar to give, and I recommend if you're looking for one to adapt your own to similar to this, where you can work with a bunch of people to come up with ideas during prep time and to simulate one, which is what I'll do today. I'm going to start off with a PowerPoint presentation, just talking about the basics of prep time, and also I think how to guide your own prep time. And I think this can be helpful for beginner debaters. It could also be helpful, I think, for debaters who have the basics down packed, but feel as though they could be optimizing their prep time, or feel as though a lot of their ideas kind of just come randomly and on the spot during the debate, and want to feel kind of ready to start the round when it happens, especially for a PM. I think this is pretty useful. And then also, I think that, as I'll explain later, the seminar, or I guess the drill that happens at the second half of this seminar, I think is really useful for me and a lot of the people on my debate team. We use this to get better. And funnily enough, when we used to go to a prison in Kingston and teach inmates, I'll shamelessly plug, if anyone's interested in starting a prison outreach program at their university or just in their community, feel free to reach out. But when we started doing this, actually, a lot of the times at the prison in Kingston at Collins Bay, we found that we ourselves were actually becoming better debaters. And one of the reasons why we increased quickly was because we were doing this exercise a couple of times a week, actually, and teaching it. So, long introduction. With that being said, I'm going to start off by doing a PowerPoint presentation, just explaining the basics of prep time and kind of overseeing what I use my prep time like and what's been helpful for me. And then we'll go into the drill afterward. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. And we'll get right into it. Awesome. So let's get started. So obviously prep time for British parliamentary is the 15 minutes before you get started into the actual round. But this is how I think it can be useful to split up your prep time to optimize it. So I'd say the first 1 to 3 minutes are independent prep time to brainstorm. So even though you have your partner, you take that time to just write down on the page anything and everything you think of. I'm going to go into depth for each of these points. The 3 to 4 minute mark is to share notes, to communicate with your partner. The 4 to 6 is to make sure you both understand the motion and the frame. So before you kind of go into further exploration, you want to make sure that both of you have a better idea about all the words in motion. It might seem reverse to do that, I think, after sharing notes, but at least for me, it's been useful, and I'll explain that further. The 6 to 10 minute mark, further explore those current ideas and maybe some new ones and discuss that main case that you're going to go with. I find that once I get started talking to my partner, a lot more things come out, or further details. This is great. And then that 10 to 15, I'm going to say there's two different things. If you're the first speaker, you're prepping and expanding your case fully. So you're really, especially if you're a PM or you're a leader of opposition, you're really going in depth into what you need to do in your speech. And then if you're the second speaker, you're prepping responses and coming up with ideas about the opposition case. I'm not sure if this was something that was taught to people early on. I know for me, I probably didn't learn that you should think about your op case. And I can actually remember the exact tournament that this happened for me at until I was in second or third year. And I remember something strange clicking in me. And I was like, well, I always do think about the opposition and I think about what that means. But a lot of the time, I don't actually think about what does that mean in relation to my case? And what do I need to do to my case in order to make it win against those things, not just be aware that they might say those things. Okay, it's a long introduction, but that's what those 15 minutes can look like, or look like as a strategy. And again, take everything I say with a grain of salt. This is one way. If you God forbid, you use this at a tournament and then you go, this did not work, but maybe one of these sections did. The whole point of debate, which I think is pretty cool, is to take things from other people and then go, what works for me in my brain and what will make me enjoy the debate the most and have the best results for me. Okay, taking notes. Before we get into that, I think taking notes is super important. And not only during a debate, but setting up your page and your prepared notes will better help you to understand the debate and prepare for your speech. When I first started debating, I would literally have to take my first set of notes and then rewrite them during my prep because I didn't understand that there was ways that you could strategize in order to not have to rewrite your notes after you had taken them once. What I would say is you're going to leave lots of space underneath your initial ideas. You're not going to write, okay, here are my 5 ideas in one chunk. You're going to say, okay, here's idea number 1, and I'm going to write it out in a line. And then I leave space when I'm first starting idea number 2, number 3. This way, your brainstorm kind of isn't okay, now I have to select and I have to rewrite. I can fill in the gaps and fill in the blanks as they come to me, and I'm leaving the space for this. Again, a lot of this is related to hand-taken notes and not to the laptop, because the laptop uses that advantage of, well, I can just copy and paste and move around. But again, if you're at a high level or even at a lower level, whatever it might be, you're going to probably use hand-taken notes, or I think your best creations, and my best creations at least, do come from hand-taken notes. Okay, so the next thing is write down ideas as soon as you get them, just as they are. You're not going to sit on an idea and during your first few minutes be like, well, I don't know that it's perfect or that it makes sense. Get it all out. If you don't use it, you don't use it. If you tweak the wording of it, you cross it out or you erase or whatever it might be, then that's what you do. But you want to get it all down on the paper because it might be useful later. It might be a good response at some point, but at least you have it down. And also, once it's written down, it feels less daunting, especially in a difficult motion, to be like, oh, there are 5 things on my paper. Maybe only 2 of them are useful, but I have 5 things. I'm ready to go. That feels a lot better. And don't forget to write down all the framing you'll include, right? It's easy to just skip over this, especially during the duration of your prep time. But I'll tell you one thing, especially if you're like PM and Prime Minister and all that, or I guess PM and Prime Minister are the same thing, okay? But on side opposition, it's still important to have your framing because it contextualizes the way that you see the world, right? The way that you see the debate. So when it clashes then, and like you're looking at your piece of paper with what the PM has said, then you can understand, okay, how do I need to adapt or change the way that I'm thinking about this? Or how do I need to call out the PM and say, actually, you're wrong, or actually, this is how the world could be or should be, etc. So that's kind of note-taking. And when I go to do the drill, hopefully image of what note-taking looks like, although it'll be on the computer for simplicity's sake, for screen sharing sake, but I do think it will hopefully be helpful to some degree. Okay, let's move on. So moving now into our ideas for the first 1 to 3 minutes of your independent brainstorm. Clearly, you're taking time alone and you're thinking of 2 to 3 general arguments for government. Let's use the motion example. This house would make fines relative to wealth. Simple explanation, we would make it so that a fine, so a parking ticket, is a good example of this. A speeding ticket, for example, are relative to wealth. So dependent on, the amount of income that you make, you could frame it that way, or the amount of money that you actually have in the bank, you could frame it that way. You would pay different amounts depending on the amount of money you had. So let's say you make, $60,000 a year, you're going to pay, maybe $10 for a parking ticket. But if you make, $100,000 a year, you pay $15 for a parking ticket, or $20 for a parking ticket, whatever it might be. So 2 to 3 arguments, and they don't have to be perfect, but what comes to mind immediately for me is a few things. 1, equity. This is a big part of the debate. How do we ensure that the punishment is distributed in a way that equally affects each person and equally not just, on side opposition when it's not relative to wealth? It's everybody pays $20 and that's equal. But when it comes to equity, it's everybody pays relative to the amount of resources so that they have, to relative to the amount of money they're able to make dependent on their circumstances. And this becomes a big clash. And even though this isn't like a point for gov, this is a point of clash that immediately comes to mind for me when I think about the motion. This is going to be important. And again, like I said, even if it's not perfect, right? It's not a poignant and then like a specific thing, here's how we get off. It's here's a path or a concept that will become relevant in this round that we could perhaps win on. The next one is, what are fines used for, right? And how can they be best utilized? Likely to gain more money in order to hopefully eliminate poverty and crime at their core. So I think depending on the way this motion is kind of modeled, this could be to either side. On-site opposition, it's everybody pays $20 and you are guaranteed to have that $20. Then on-site government, it's, well, maybe you get, $10 a lot of the time, but maybe there's also a lot of the time that you're having people who have to pay $30 or $40, and that's a guaranteed more amount of money, right? And then you consider, well, if like people with less money have to pay less money. Maybe they end up with more parking tickets or more speeding tickets. And then I don't know, I also consider ideas of like, confronting crime of like more interactions, right? Or maybe it's the case that now, because they get less money, police officers are going to be told, well, you have to be cracking down more on speeding tickets. You have to be stopping more people. And then this idea of less likely to avoid confronting crime. If the punishment will not put you in debt, then maybe you take account for it if it is reasonable, right? So the thing is, a lot of the time, I think people with parking tickets or, whatever kind of fine, a lot of people will avoid the law or will avoid paying these things or try to find loopholes because they say, well, getting a $60 parking ticket just because I, didn't come out on time from where I was, it's kind of ridiculous. And I don't have $60 just lying around. So I'm going to put it off, or I'm going to try to get out of this, or it's going to take me longer to pay it. Or maybe I just end up never paying it. And that's kind of a problem for me in the long term, or it's a private lot, whatever it might be. These are ideas to consider within the round. And this is kind of, when I was first writing this down, this is what immediately comes to mind for me. And these are areas of the debate that could be round winning, but maybe one of them will be dropped in the round. That's completely fine. So that's my independent brainstorm. It's kind of come as you are. It's not super pointed, but it's just, these are what come to my head of ideas within this round. So then sharing notes, right? So each partner should take between 2 to 3, or should have between 2 to 3 points that they believe could work. Sometimes you'll have more, and sometimes your partner may be like, I know nothing about this. I have one idea, and that's completely fine. That used to happen to me a lot, where until I kind of heard what my partner had to say, and this is strengths and weaknesses in each person, I couldn't really come up with something because I wasn't in the right mindset. But as soon as I heard what my partner said, I went, oh my goodness, of course. And then I had more to add. So just share the gist of the idea. You don't want to spend 5 minutes giving a debate speech during your prep. I think that's something that happened to me a lot when I was first starting out debate, even in my second year, third year. Sometimes I get really into a topic and I'd be like, and here's all my stuff. No need, right? If you know what you're talking about, you're talking about. You should not be taking the time, the glorious 15 minutes, to take 5 of those minutes to explain a thought or an idea. Keep it in, share later. And then there's some ideas here, right? So how to tell if a point is worth using. This isn't a sure guaranteed way to know, but normally if the points overlap, so for example, if both me and my partner have this one point and we're like, we think this is pretty strong, we have a lot of ideas for this one, a lot of the time that's a good point to use. And I'll get into this more, but you don't want to use an argument that you're like, well, maybe I've heard this buzzword before in relation to economics. I think we should just use like gig economy because it's like, it sounds like it. But, the motion is not about the gig economy. You don't want to just take things that you associate and bank all your stuff on it. You want to make sure you understand the argumentation. So I think this is a pretty good idea, and way to do it is if you and your partner both get it, awesome. A good thing to start off from. Might change over time, but that's okay. You'll probably debate better just by nature if you both have it. Or if one person is like, I know a lot about this topic and I know for sure that this is where the clash goes. I've debated this before, or I took a class on this and this is like the number one issue that we talk about in this class. I know how to explain it. Perhaps that person's going to take the lead, speak first, and they're going to say, I'm going to take the lead here, I'm going to explain it. And then you're going to come in and you're going to support that thing. That's another way to know. So then after you kind of go through here, you're going to then decide, right? So what are the 2 best points? And then you're going to talk about what the main clash is. What do we have to do to win the debate? I think that this is something that I struggled with for a really long time, was not actually understanding, okay, what do I need to talk about? Not just, oh, I want to talk about this, or, well, I have 5 things written down on my page. I'll just go through those 5 things. I'll fill my time and hopefully something good happens from it. I think having a strategic discussion, super important. So do we need to prove exclusivity? Do we need to prove that only this good thing or this bad thing happens on their side, good thing on our side? Do we need to prove a harm? Do we need to prove on their side of the house that it's just holistically bad, or this one really bad thing happens on their side and that makes it not viable? Do we have to talk about impact? Do we need to say which side of the house, both are fighting for something good, but which one does it better? Which has a bigger impact? I think conceptualizing what the round really boils down to is super important when you're deciding what you're going to do, and also just framing the way you're going to approach the motion. If you disagree about the most important points, which can happen sometimes, people are people, at a certain point, you do just need to come to a decision for what to include and what not to include. My general rule of thumb is the first speaker generally gets a final say. And I'll say this just because if second speaker, someone who normally is a second speaker, is super passionate about it, they can jump in. But I think if you're really like getting into a clash with your partner, you shouldn't make somebody speak first on something that they're unclear about. Like if a big point of clash is like speaker one is like, well, I think it should be about this because I think this wins the round and it's super detailed and I know all the stuff about it. But you, speaker two, should be the PM and you should explain it. And then I know so much about it, so I can explain it afterward. Normally this idea works, but I just don't think, and especially if you're newer to debate, it's fair to put that person in that position, especially if they're like, well, I don't even want to talk about this. I don't know a lot about it. I'm uncomfortable. If you are going to take that lead, you should speak first. Give that second speaker more time to get on board, to write out what you're saying, to understand what you're saying, and then go from there. I think that that's generally a rule of thumb. When it gets more into you've been debating with your partner for a long time, you gain a more trusting dynamic or a more understanding of how you prioritize it. But especially if you're with a new partner or you're new to the activity, I think this is a good rule of thumb to go with. And I've gone with it before and it's worked out. Go over any uncertainties within the framing and definitions, right? So, if there's a word that maybe somebody's like, well, I'm pretty sure it's this, but it could be that, or even just if you guys are both sure about it, make sure you're like, okay, even though we both know what all of this stuff means, now decide what actually should be said in the framing of the motion, because it might make sense to you, but the average person, or just, what is the burden of the PM or even of the first speaker on any team to make sure that people understand the types of arguments you're making or how you conceptualize the round. And if the PM misses it, make sure you include it. And then lastly, I would say by this point, you should decide who's speaking first and who's speaking second, because then you're going to go into prepping even further. And like I said before, typically first speaker, either you are, you're for sure first speaker, someone for sure always speaks second, that's how you've done it. Or if you're people that are versatile with it, perhaps it's the person who knows more about it goes first. I know that there's like ideas that like the person who knows more should go second because then they can like tie up the loose ends. But I do actually think a lot of the time it's more useful because typically the tying of the loose end skill is not reliant on like knowing things. It's just the skill that you have when you learn information, being able to decipher what's important and what's not. Your partner can always sit down and say, hey, the two most important parts of this, I think, are this and this, and then you can center on that. You can always be supported. But if your skill set just does lie in that kind of different ability to take what's been said and package it in a nice present to be able to be like, this is exactly what this round is and this is how we win. I think a second speaker is a second speaker a lot of the time. Maybe that's a controversial take, but I think it can be helpful there. Okay. If it wants to let me click. Okay, awesome. So decide on the case, 6 to 10 minutes. How to determine the right case. A couple of rules of thumb and checklists. Do you understand the case, right? Like I said before, like maybe you saw your pros like giving a seminar and they were like, a really good case for economics is like, I don't know, supply and demand. That's a really bad idea. But what if it was like, a specific kind of term and they were like kind of saying that and you're like, oh, like I heard my pro say this in a slideshow once, or I saw my pro win this in a round, or I saw somebody else who I think is really cool who debates say this once and I want to say it. It's a bad way to do it. Or if you just don't know a lot about it, if you're just like, oh, well, the right case is probably this, but I don't really know it, you should definitely include it somewhere in your speech and try to figure out throughout the round what it's about, but that's not the best. Is it fair? Can the other team reasonably debate against it and with its framing, right? You don't want to be told that you're squirreling the motion, that you're, making it too specific so that nobody else can access it, or, you don't really want to make up the world in a way that you have to force other people to argue things they'd never want to argue for, or things that are just blatantly inequitable, right? Like if you create a dichotomy where you're like, on our side of the house, this is the world, and on their side, it has to be this way. You don't want to do that. Does it have a big impact is a question, right? You might have a a solid case, and it's like, it's meaningful, and you've been able to impact and mechanize it, but at the end of the day, it's not a big impact. And that on opposition or on your opening or your closing, that they can find something that'll be bigger that will win against you. You want to make sure you're finding the biggest impact with the most realistic ways of building that world and building that mechanization. Is it relevant to the motion? My favorite example when I'm teaching is to be like, if we're talking about the environment and you love lizards, and you're like, I actually just want to talk about this very specific kind of like endangered lizard for 7 minutes. That's sick. And like, you should write a CP motion about it. But I think a lot of the time you just end up like going off track and talking about your interests or talking about something you just like watched a nature documentary on last night. And you got to think, does this specific lizard really matter here? I know I want to talk about it, but maybe that's saved for the chat after the round. Make sure it's relevant and you can connect it back easily. And then lastly, does it engage well with the general ideas of what you believe the round will look like, right? So maybe you're kind of like, well, I think the main clash is A, but I really just think B is like the most interesting part of this. Sometimes you got to throw B aside, even though you're like, this is a sick argument, this is awesome, just got to throw it out. Or you got to save it for refutation. You got to save it for later, but it shouldn't be your biggest case or your extension. Maybe it's some supporting info. So deciding on that case is super important, and that's kind of how you can work through that. All right, case flush and response prep. So like I said, kind of in the intro, first speaker and the second speaker, I believe at this point, dive into just very, very different things. The first speaker is going to flesh out the idea. They have to speak first. If they're in the front half, they got to speak really soon. And they're going to come up with their point, their reasoning, their mechanization, their relevance. You know, a lot of people talk about pale, but I think that it can be a bit different. Your point still exists, but your reasoning, why is it there? Why is it relevant? Your mechanization. And then I guess I just said, why is it relevant? But its relevance to the motion, linking it back to really what the crux of the argument is, to what the clashes are, why does this win the round? So many of the times, even the most experienced debaters just forget to include this part. And I think that is pretty crucial. Are these ideas relevant? Like I said, have I given enough context for the argumentation to work as I intended to, right? I used to really struggle with assuming that everybody knew what I knew or was in the same headspace as me or saw the world the same way, or that people just understood the types of words that I naturally used. And I think that slowing down a little bit and being able to be like, okay, am I really explaining this? Like if my 8-year-old cousin was sitting in the audience and I wanted him to understand what I'm talking about right now, could he pick up this? For the most part, could he understand it? I think that's a good rule of thumb. Because, university debaters are smart, but, I've had so many judging experiences where I'm like, this is not what I hope for. Okay, do I understand the importance of these arguments? You don't want to get up there and be like, this is what my argument is. And like, why does this matter? And you're like, that's a really good question that I don't have answers to. Defer to my partner. You never want to do that. Sometimes you have to, but you don't want to. And then that second speaker, which is pretty sick, I think, is what's the basics of the op case? It's like, all right, now what? Now I have to think about what the complete opposition is. I'm going to brainstorm those arguments, the same thing I did during my independent time. And then I'm going to look at those arguments and I'm going to look at my arguments and I'm going to see where they clash. Where do they meet? What are the things that come together and hit each other? And how do I make it so that I win out over them? What do I think are the things that kind of look good together? And then I'm going to go, okay, what else are we going to probably drop? What can we easily decide are not that important? And then what pre-rebuttal and responses work? And what are the, again, like I said before, what are the main clashes of the debate? But how can I come up with easy responses beforehand so that in the moment I don't have to think of them? I can write down my actual speech. I can keep going through, or I can give these responses to my partner to use if they need them. Okay, so that's my general seminar. And again, people have different ways of doing it. I think this is the easiest way. And I will flag, sometimes I do use this op idea earlier on in the prep time. Sometimes when I'm coming up with my ideas, I immediately think, okay, what actually is that op case and what are they going to run? And like, what do I have to beat? But I think this is a good way to start off because I think sometimes if you're thinking of the round two holistically at the beginning of your prep, can get lost in there, lost in the sauce. But this is a good way to say, okay, first speaker is running with what they've got. And now I have more time. I'm going to write out what are my responses. Okay, so that's awesome. Now we're going to move on into this drill that I mentioned earlier. So we're going to use the motion, this house as the social movement prefers prison reform as opposed to prison abolition. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take 15 minutes to completely prep out the full debate. I'm going to talk and share a screen and a paper and kind of explain where my head's at as I'm doing it. we're going to use like only 15 minutes and really go through it. I'll flag one more time because why not? This was one of the coolest experiences I've had in relation to debate, was volunteering in Collins Bay, and running this motion with some inmates. It was awesome. And genuinely super interesting ideas, super cool to just do this full prep time. So if you ever get a chance to do that, recommend it highly. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to pull up my second document, which is going to be kind of my prep sheet. And then I'm also going to grab my timer while I do that. So I don't know, normally when I'm teaching a live class, I say, grab a drink of water, or I don't know, someone tells me a fun fact right now, but I gotta do without a fun fact, which is really too bad. All right. Cool. All right. I'm gonna bring you into this document, which just has some bare bones so that I don't have to make this later. I'm gonna share my screen one more time. Awesome. Okay, and then hopefully there will be a little time edited onto this, but if it's not, it's not, that's okay. But yeah, I'm gonna start my timer. I'm gonna take one small breath. Oh, okay, a lot of talking. So I'm going to start my timer. I've got my 0 minutes here and we'll be done in 15 minutes. And let's see what Livy can get done in 15 minutes. It's, again, this is, I think, a great drill. Again, I know a lot of the time people, and I've been recommended, take a 15-minute prep and give a speech. You only have 15 minutes, you get her done. You're sitting in between classes, you're bored in class, you're on the bus, you're just doing whatever. This is a really quick thing I can do, or you can do, that really helps me to think of ideas. All right, I'm now even somehow procrastinating within the seminar. All right, let's do it. I'm gonna start 3, 2, 1. This house, as the social movement, prefers prison reform as opposed to prison abolition. Some framing perhaps will help us here. Social movement, right? It's an interesting concept, the social movement, but I'm assuming fighting for the best possible conditions for inmates. And then I'm also going to assume here like feasibility, right? Feasibility, mobility, you know, and like likelihood. Likelihood, I can't spell either, so it's gonna be good. Likelihood is pretty important. Okay, then moving on to prison reform. Prison reform is changing the way prisons exist, but they still do exist. Likely to change who is in there, why they are in there, conditions, sentencing, and then we're gonna go prison abolition. We're gonna go no more prisons. Awesome. This means physical buildings, so getting rid of some prisons sometimes, and then the concept of this form of punishment to be eliminated. And then alternative is likely like rehab, no sentence, rehab, no sentence, service in different ways. Then we go on to brainstorming. What are my thoughts? I'm on preferring prison reform as opposed to prison abolition. I'm gonna flag I'm at 145 right now. Okay, what are my first thoughts when I think of prison reform as opposed to prison abolition? Reform, I think of one, more likelihood of more people will be into this, right? So average person is scared of crime, wants prisons to feel good, right? Crime's off the streets. I have kids, you know, there aren't people who I'm scared of around me. You know, hard to change people's minds. Prisons exist right now. How do we do such a large transformation? Yeah, I think another one for prison reform. What's good about prison reform, or what's bad about prison abolition? I think one idea of abolition bad is that you can argue there are some people that need to be away from the community for some time, right? What is the alternative? I guess reform can be awesome is another idea that I have. So this can mean that people are only in there for violence and super intensely threatening things. Reform to our prison system can mean that there is like art. I don't know, art's pretty cool, and public programming. That means people have to be helped. I think one idea here is like with abolition, it could mean that our government or systems kind of leave us alone and do not care to help in any way. Prison itself is a scary thought and is a deterrent for some. Without it, more crime or more people could not be as careful in their actions, which whether or not you think that's real, that's you. So these are just some ideas I immediately come up with when I think of why prison reform is better than prison abolition. So that's my first thoughts. That's what we're doing. So now I want to think about it. And even though these aren't fully fleshed out, these are just what comes to my head. We're at 5 minutes. And I'm going to go, okay, I think the biggest thing here is this. I think what is more likely to be bought into, right? So buy-in, this as the social movement, is pretty important here in terms of changing the quality of life, right? So I think that I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think the main impact for this one is just mobility is this theme and changing the quality of life for many. I think that what we can talk about here and just add into this social movement thing is a goal to get people on board, to vote, to raise awareness, and to make community and social changes. And I think that what we can prove is that prison reform bridges that gap. Okay, I think this is a big point. And then I think deterrent is probably good, but then I think there's an argument in here missing about why, like, I think op can easily just be like, oh, prison bad generally, there are too many prisons, et cetera, et cetera. I think the too many prisons thing is easy to take down, but it's like conditions of prisons, right? Like you can kind of do a response, and I'll get into this when we get into that, but like the biggest thing is that like prison bad because prison treat people bad, right? But if now reform is like seriously important to people about creating spaces where, less people are in prison, right? Less people, need to go there. Reform means that, the types of programs they're offering are different. Maybe rehabilitation is a stronger force for a lot of people, or like mental health help, stuff like that. Is better, and also the conditions of inmates are better. Perhaps prison reform also, I guess framing when we talk about this can look like better staff, so better training, different standards of who can be staff, expectations, etc. That's important. But yeah, so then we move into main arguments, and it's like this goes in here, I think, and then you can say like, I think it's like, yeah, this thing of like changing the quality of life for many. So I think then we can just be like, okay, this is number 2, and this is completely fine too, to just be like, I'm gonna actually change the way that I'm gonna talk about this. which is like, reform can be awesome, probably. And you'd have to convince me of this personally, but reform can be awesome, and we'll talk about it that way. It's also like a quicker change to help more people, right? I think abolition is likely to be just like less prisons, which means less inmates, which means more funding going to other prisons. This is good. But on our side, the people in prison in the interim just legislatively likely have better lives, right? Like, for example, with reform, every time a bill or legislation is passed, it makes like thousands, like probably hundreds of thousands or thousands, if we're gonna go lower, of inmates' lives drastically better. I.e., if we're talking about like violence restrictions, for example, reform is like when they took away solitary confinement in certain contexts, or like when it came to solitary confinement, they changed it so that even if you're in solitary confinement, you still have to have like 2 days of the day where you're offered and given human interaction and outdoor time, which is a huge difference. Like, if you're in solitary confinement for 3 months and you never see outside, like, you go crazy. And you still probably go crazy if you're in solitary confinement, the alternative, but at least in the status quo with for like, and you can argue this is a type of reform where it's like now you have to have interaction, which is good for you, people talking to you and caring for you. And that interaction lots of the time is like someone who has like mental health training, and or you get like activities, and like, or you can go outside and you could like go for a run, or you could just sit and like absorb sunlight. This feels pretty important. Whereas like with abolition, you have to prove, and I think that like with the main arguments, you can explain this more, where it's like it's unlikely that such a revolution will happen, i.e., that people will care enough and long enough to have concrete changes to the way the world works. The trade-off is easier. It's also like less manpower or people to buy in. Like, these are the types of things, these are the trade-offs, and you have to characterize this too, right? And also just that the social movement has like limited resources, and like, how do you do that? It's way easier to convince somebody like of that solitary confinement argument, where it's like this thing that you think you care about, like prisons themselves, to feel good and safe, still exist, but people inside them just get to like be treated as human beings. I think that's an easier sell to like someone's mother than like, yeah, and now like they're in your community before they've served their 5 years or 20 years or 80 years that you think they deserve for this thing you have nothing to do with. Like, it's so much harder to convince people to have like criminals or inmates closer to them, I think, like, and to change that mindset, as opposed to like, this person is still far away from you, but also they get rights. I think that's easier. More people will buy in. Okay, now we are at 11:33. And now it's time to opt it out, because this will really help us here. Prison abolition. So we're fighting for prison abolition. First thing that comes to mind, prisons are very bad. I don't know, intuitively to me, prisons are very bad, inhumane, awful staff a lot of the time. People did not always do the crime. Yeah. Underfunded, but somehow overfunded. Money could go elsewhere, right? Could go into education, which would prevent a lot of crimes like mental health and addiction centers and helping, right? Also, we likely care more about the people in our community that need the most help when we don't get to ship them off, right? Like this person is doing drugs in my community and is taking up space, and I don't like it when my kids walk by them at night. So I'm going to call the cops on them. And now they're going to be found with this illegal drug. And now we're going to find out all these other things about them. They're not going to appear to their court date, or they're going to act poorly in front of the police or whoever. And now suddenly they're in prison for 2 years, or suddenly all of their items on them have been confiscated, etc. They're worse off. I'm not going to This is an exact example of I'm talking too much about things that I care about. This is a perfect flag. Okay, and then lastly, we can close specific prisons. That's awesome. Housing, less people can go to prisons, more money. Okay, awesome. So then now what I'm going to do is I would have already done this before if I was writing in terms of my way of doing it. But now I'm going to put my main ones in here, paste, awesome. And I'm going to look. So I have prisons are bad, they're inhumane, etc., etc. And I think this point clashes directly with this point. Reform can be awesome. How can it help people? What can it do for them? Reform can be an imagined world that really transforms later on into even better facilities that don't really resemble prisons that much. You can talk about this long-span change and how slow incremental changes are better than just this principle. And you could agree that that prisons are inhumane, but also say, how does a social movement change this? How do we become more likable in that way? More people are into this, just like I'm saying, right? These all kind of go together. And I think this is a difficult motion in some ways, but people will be more into this, right? And then you think about like how you mobilize money, right? So here it says like money could go elsewhere, but then your question becomes over here, well, if you can't actually convince people of abolition, you can only convince like a small group, and then you can only like close a couple of prisons, that money is actually likely to still go into like bad things or not actually into the programs you need. You need like a mental mind shift, and that shift has to happen slowly over time. So I think that's like the big clashes within the round, and that's pretty clear. Okay, 507. You're probably like now being told you're still chatting to your partner, but this is the gist of how I would do it. I think that this is less information because I don't have a debate partner with me who's, fleshing out our gov case, and then we could show you. But I think this is a really good way to do it in terms of getting the most content out of you as fast as possible. I would just flag that I think this op development thing is super important, and just sees how the round is going to play out here, right? So, I see very clearly in front of me, what are we talking about? And there's a chance that you miss a point or a really big thing out of that other case. But if you're in a BP round, it's likely that these things, whatever was intuitive to you, will become major themes in the round, whether your opening opposition is able to explain them well or not, or whether your closing opposition's extension is like a really long explanation or a good example of a lot of these things. You'll still have to engage with them, and having that one up of like, well, I've already thought about what you're going to say or what you care about, or like what I would say in your position, which is likely good stuff because you're likely such a smart person. I think that's pretty good. And again, like at the beginning here, we left a few things behind, right? Like, this kind of idea of there's some people that need to be away from the community. It depends on where the round looks like, right? I've seen this round run where people can come to a place of there are people, and every side, every position agrees that there are some people that need to probably be put away or need to be harmed in some way or punished. And then you can talk about why punishment could look different for different communities. I think there's a really good example of Indigenous communities on the side of abolition, where it's like there are some Indigenous communities that if somebody like murders somebody else, then that person has to take on the experience of that person that they've murdered, right? So they say, well, now you have to do the job that person had in that community. You have to do the labor. Or if this person was a leader in some way, you have to take that on. If this person had relationships to that family, you have to provide for that family. You have to give up money and resources for that family because you've taken away a vital member of that community, and now you in some way need to like make up for that, right? So you can talk about how prisons actually like take away ownership from, sorry if you can hear my cat, but you take away ownership from the communities themselves know better. That's another opposition argument that changes the way the round goes. The way I prepped it, I'm envisioning it as we all think prisons are probably pretty bad, and we want to see the way the system works differently. But some people might think punishment at its core is something that needs to be enforced in some ways. Are prison the best way to do that? Perhaps punishment is not best perpetrated through prisons. We're unsure. So with that being said, this is the general vibe. I think that if I had just had this, I could go into a debate, give a speech. Perhaps it's just because I care about this motion, but that's relatively unclear. All right, so that is my seminar for today. Yeah, if you take away anything from this, it's hopefully some form of structure or just something that allows you to really fill your time and make you feel organized going into your speech, think on your feet. But again, that drill seems very simple, but it's very helpful. And I also find as a debater, as a speaker, speaking it out loud to people, teaching it to people, it's really good. So if you're somebody who runs a debate club, feel free to take that as something that might be useful for you to get, your whole group together for a seminar, have people raising hands at what should happen next, group prep time. It's awesome. But yeah, thanks if you listened to the seminar, that's awesome. Thanks so much for your time. Maybe you thought different about prisons, I don't know, but yeah, thanks so much.